Now let's look at the body. So you're going to begin your paragraphs, as I said earlier, with a topic. I'm going to call it a topic transition sentence, so we don't make the mistake of writing those little siloed paragraphs. Link to the previous paragraph, furthering the idea. You're going to provide some really good textual references, and this is so tough. You've got 2 texts in 40 minutes, so you need to choose well. Remember the word? Be judicious in your choice. Weave through the essay references to context, but don't just do this little low order, it's been World War I or World War II. Think of ways of thinking. Think about, whether it's postmodern way of thinking or whether in fact, they're looking at, in 1984, they're looking at a nihilist way of thinking. Ensure that you refer to the core values, as we said earlier. And you're going to move between these texts with a balanced analysis. So for example, you can't just do 3/4 of your essay on one text and then finish up with the other. You're going to, as I said, balanced. There are 2 electives. You could either be doing intertextual connections, and this one is a comparison of texts. That's all it is. It's a comparison of texts to explore the effects of context, purpose and audience on meaning. A lot of these are almost like an old transformation module. They're looking at texts that are very closely connected to another text, that are actually valuing the other text. So you do all the same things I've just talked about. You need to look at context all the way through, and how does the language and the ideas and the values and attitudes in each text connect to each other? So what's the relationship? Second one, I'll jump to in a moment, but I'll just give you an example. Richard III and Looking for Richard is Intertextual Connections. So if you look at Richard III, Shakespeare's play, and Al Pacino's Looking for Richard, they're products of different times, yet they're connected by what it means to be human. Both are fascinated with Richard III, who's this enigmatic villain, quite charismatic, but at the same time, dastardly evil. So Pacino, of course, sets out to stress the continuing relevance and significance of Shakespeare's craft, the power of his stories, and the universality of his ideas. And he chooses at length those scenes in the play, Richard III, that reveal our flaws the most, such as the seduction of Lady Anne, the murder of Clarence. And both contexts are marked by this idea of the Machiavellian pursuit of power. So you can actually, when you look at the core of it, I can do a diagram that captures it. At the heart and centre of it is social, cultural and historical context and values. Once you've got that core, the zeitgeist, you then move out to the composer's perspectives, purpose and audience. That then informs their choice of language forms and features, the ideas and the values and attitudes. And then you get the connections between character, setting, language, form and ideas of the 2 texts. The second elective has got a little bit of a different frame. So it's not just a comparative study. You've actually got a lens that you need to look through. And this is perspectives. Interestingly enough, it says intertextual perspectives. Not using intertextual in the literary sense, but using it simply to mean when I look between the text, the 2 composers' perspectives, the characters in the text, what does it tell me? So it's how the perspectives of the characters in text reflect the composer's context, perspective, purpose and audience. Perspective is actually an enabling purpose. It's a culturally learnt position. It's how we view a text. It's how we view the world through our experiences, our values, our attitudes. However, our perspective really it creates a position of preferred reading. So for example, a composer is deliberately situating you in a certain way to think. So it's how the perspectives of the characters in the text when considered together inform understanding, and also it's how do you derive meaning when you consider both together. So similar diagram, but this time you've got social, cultural and historical at the heart. And again, moving up to perspectives of the composer, moving up to the choice of language forms and features. But this time, instead of just being a comparative study, it's now a comparative study through the perspective of characters and meaning conveyed through a synthesis of both texts. So just remember the difference. One is just a comparative study, this one is a comparative through the lens of perspectives. So to give you an example, 1984 in Metropolis, and probably the one that's being done by a lot of the state this year, and I imagine it continue to be popular in the next number of years. Both Orwell and Lang, 21 years apart in their texts, present the imminent dangers of the contemporary social and political world of their time. They're looking at the mechanisms of power and hence dystopian genre that they're using. Both texts look at state control and power and the suppression of individuality. Both Orwell and Lang utilise protagonists who reject the structures of their society. And both texts examine how traditional values are compromised, such as truth and compassion. So if I would look at the essay now, using this as the example, in terms of form, they're both dystopian, but there's a difference. Remember, World War II hasn't happened. The atomic bomb hasn't been dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We haven't got totalitarian powers yet. So Metropolis in 1927 is a merging of utopian and dystopian genres. There's still hope, and it's coming very much through a Catholic lens with Lang. By 1948, in 1984, the text, Orwell has lost all hope for humanity, and he's presenting a nihilistic view of the future. So he's moved from existentialism, which is what piece of work is a man, or what's self-knowledge, what's my existence, who am I, to there is no hope. Both you have got this modernist fascination with the subconscious. So Metropolis, you've got German Expressionism, and that has influenced the camera work. So for example, German Expressionism means that the actors, because it's a silent film, have got exaggerated movements, their face, their body movements, reflecting their mindscape. And of course in 1984, although it's in the third person, very much a limited narration, it emulates the notion of the stream of consciousness, because you feel as if you're inside his head, even though you know it's Orwell speaking. You've also got the context that links both of them, both looking at industrialisation, mechanisation of the workforce, and the psychology of the tyranny of time and compliance on their workers. There's the abuse of power by the multinationals in governance. There's panoptical surveillance, which means this panoptical idea of everyone looking at you every moment of the day, watching you, Big Brother. The tragedy of war and its weapons, the use of propaganda and conformity, and there's anxiety and fear for the future. In the Weimar Republic, you had 22 public executions of politicians. Post-World War II, you've got the bombs. And of course, perspective, Lang and Orwell, both are actually very conservative and traditionalist. Both hearken to the golden age. So Lang is a conservative Christian, but he's critical of dominant ideologies. Orwell himself writes for a political purpose. He actually says he wants to fuse artistry with a political purpose. And he says, I write because there's some lie I want to expose. Then if we look at the characters, and then you're going to move from the composers into the characters, you're going to look at Maria's perspective, which is evident through the point of view shots and close-ups in Metropolis. She's, I suppose, the maternal mother figure, John the Baptist, but she's also the Virgin Mary, and she suffers for the workers. And you can look at all sorts of things like Todorov's theory of equilibrium in film, because she always upsets the equilibrium. Remember, this is a time when women are starting to assert their rights in the Weimar Germany. And Julia in 1984 is a symbolic figure of Winston's rebellion. She's really there for Winston rather than for herself. And then we've got Freda in Metropolis, who rebels against his father, and he's your hero. Suffers from the Oedipus complex though. And his perspective is altered from one of indifference to compassion for the workers. Winston, on the other hand, has got this traditional perspective, but he's an anti-hero. He's cynical, full of pessimism, and knows that Big Brother will get him. And we look at two more, the workers and the proles. The workers in Metropolis, just like the proles in 1984, are compliant. They're just cogs in the machine, and they're completely oppressed by both powers. And lastly, those people that wield power, Fredersen in Metropolis, he's actually a megalomaniac who controls all the industry. He only cares about profit and control. He's like the Old Testament Jehovah. And of course, O'Brien represents the party in 1984. And he says things like, whatever the party holds to be truth is true. And that leads to three key ideas. Control, both texts examine the manipulation and control exerted over citizens, the illusionary nature of free will, and lastly, the pursuit and abuse of power. Now, what does that tell us then in a comparative study? And I'm going to show you an introduction to an essay like this. And why am I using this one at length? Because I need to show you, not once did I just talk about the text on it, those texts on their own. You'll notice I move between them. I move between ideas through perspectives of the composers and of the characters. It's so vital you learn to think like this. And when you study them, don't study them alone. Try to move between them. So I'm going to read you an opening that is by one of my students. And he's really thought, he actually really enjoyed this study. So I'm just going to read the opening. And the question was, how do these texts reflect the human condition? So he starts, while the zeitgeist may change over time, the unalterable aspect is that of the human condition. So he's immediately linked to the question. It is only the contextual ways of thinking upon these qualities and attributes which engender differentiation in composition in terms of perspective and representation. So now he's keying into the elective perspective. Both Metropolis and 1984 are a reflection of their post-war context as an exploration in the notions of the abuse of power and control unfolds in both texts. A reflection of an increasingly disenfranchised society. Notice now, context together. Lang and Orwell impose authorial perspective through the perspectives of their characters to challenge and question their societies and the compromising of traditional values such as truth, empathy and compassion. Again, note they're together. And the values I talked about earlier. When considered intertextually, the perspectives in both texts converge in their criticism of the overt use of control are mediated by social justice. But the passing of 21 years marked by yet another great war and the rise of totalitarian states has significantly altered the perspective from one of hope to nihilistic futility. Absolutely fabulous opening, because he's moving between his texts, he's considering what that means, and notice the final comment.